Hello everyone, Mr. Boltri here, bringing you video 1.2, where we're going to be talking about fair tests. Now, the first thing that I'd like for you to do is pull out your lab notebook, flip to the next available page, and in big letters at the top, write fair test notes, because we're going to be taking notes over the course of this video. And the first thing that I'd like for us to take notes on is just a couple foundational vocabulary words. Now, these might be words that you've heard before, or they might not. In either case, I would love for you to write down these 4 vocabulary words and a short definition for each. It does not have to be exactly what's on my slide, but I'm going to highlight the most important words in each of the definitions. So first is the independent variable, and that's the one that the scientist, which in this course is going to be you and me, chooses to change. It's the one that they are changing on purpose. And then the dependent variable is the one that they are observing or measuring the change in. So as the scientist changes on purpose, the independent variable, they are looking at and watching the dependent variable to see if it changes as a response. And then another word is constant, which you might also hear called control. And that's all the other factors that the scientists make sure do not change from one trial of the experiment or one run of the experiment to the next run of the experiment. They have to be the same or constant for the entire experiment. Putting all those together, there's an idea about whether a test is a fair test or not a fair test. This is also called a controlled experiment or a valid experiment. But the idea of a fair test is it's one where the scientist chooses one independent variable and they keep everything else, all the other variables, constant for the whole experiment, except for that dependent variable, which is the one that they are measuring. And that's what makes a fair test. And fair tests are important because fair tests allow scientists to make accurate conclusions based on the experiments that they've run. So to sort of solidify these terms, we're going to run through 2 examples focusing on the pipes lab, which was the subject of the last video. And I know we talked about it in class, but I really wanted to talk about the pipes lab one more time just to really solidify why it was important and what makes a fair test versus not a fair test. So as we go through these examples, I'd like for you to be watching and thinking about, in this experiment, what is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? What were the constants that were maintained or should have been maintained? And then ultimately answering the question, is it a fair test or not? So first we're going to watch the experiment that I did in the video from last time. Hey everyone, I'm going to use these 2 pipes to prove to you that changing the width of a pipe changes the pitch that it makes. So as you can clearly see, these 2 have very different widths. One even fits inside the other. So when I hit the skinny one, it makes a low sound. And when I hit the wider one, it makes a high sound, which I think proves that changing the width changes the pitch. So in that experiment, which was me, the scientists thought that they were changing the width of the pipe, and they were observing to see whether the pitch changed as a response. So you could say that, at least the way the scientist was thinking about the experiment, that their independent variable was the width and their dependent variable was the pitch. And I put a question mark by the width as the independent variable because the experiment is so questionable. And it's so questionable because of the constants that were not maintained. If you go back and look at the different pipes, they were different lengths and different materials. But the good thing that the scientists did is that the person hitting the pipe for both trials was the same. So there's one good thing there. But at the end of the day, the answer to whether is it a fair test or not is pretty clear and pretty clearly no. The reason for that is not enough constants were maintained. And this is important because in response to the scientist's claim, I claim that changing the width changes the pitch. an observer would easily be able to say, I don't really know if I agree with that claim or not, because how do you know that when the pitch changed, it wasn't because of the length? How do you know that the change wasn't because of the material? So because the scientist wasn't able to maintain constants, their claim really doesn't hold any water. It doesn't have very much validity to it. And now we're going to do a second experiment. And this is the one that Mr. Taylor did in the original video, which I have recreated for the purpose of our looking a little bit more closely at it. Hello everyone, I'd like to use these two pipes to show that changing the length of the pipe changes the pitch that it makes when you hit it on the end. So I've chosen two pipes that are different lengths, one long and one short. And I've tried to make sure that I chose two pipes that are the same width and the same material. So when I hit the long pipe, makes a low sound. And when I hit the short pipe, makes a high sound. And I think that provides a lot of evidence that changing the length of the pipe changes the pitch. So in that experiment, things get a little bit more clear, which is the value of doing scientifically valid experiments. Because the independent variable was the variable that the scientists changed on purpose. That was the length. The dependent variable was the one that the scientist was listening for, observing, or measuring. In this situation, it was the pitch. The constants, many of which were maintained, were the width, the material, the person hitting the pipe, and you could list all sorts of constants, like the same time of day, the same weather, but we try to focus on the ones that probably were going to make the most difference in the outcome of the experiment. And last but not least, was it a fair test? Yes, I believe that it was, because enough constants were maintained for you to be able to say, when the scientist makes the claim, length affects the pitch, there's no reason to doubt the scientist or the validity of the experiment because of all the constants they were maintained. So doing fair tests allows the results of your experiments to actually be believable and not be called into question. So that's the importance of fair tests. Without fair tests, we can't really make claims based on our experiments because too many things are changing for us to be sure the reason that caused the change. In our next class, we're going to do some practice problems with fair tests. And we're also going to talk about this video to make sure everything made sense. And after next class, you should be pretty good at identifying independent variables, dependent variables, and constants, and deciding whether or not something is a fair test, which is going to get you ready for quiz 1A, which is all about those experimental design things and assessing scientific validity. So if you have any questions based on the video, please do write them down in your notes, which I'm going to look at before next class, which will allow me to see if there's anything that I need to go over again or clarify. And then in next class, we'll have practice and then be good to go on fair tests. So this is Mr. Boltri signing out. It's been video 1.2, and go Bears.